Yes, well, welcome back. I'm delighted to be joined by Macer Gifford, who is the author of Fighting Evil, which was his account of his time fighting against ISIS in, is it Iraq and Syria or just Syria?
Just Syria, although I did one operation in Iraq, one operation.
And I believe so. I think you first went there in 2015 and then went back in 2016, 2017, correct?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I left the UK in just after Christmas 2014, and it was really after a few days in Iraq, getting my stuff together, getting myself prepared. I then crossed the border on New Year's Day 2015, and then that was the starting point of my journey over the next 3 years.
I'm presuming that was right after kind of the Battle of, was it Kobani?
Yeah. Well, Kobani was ongoing. So Kobani, if people were to take themselves back to sort of that summer of 2014, it was a summer of absolute horror. You saw the so-called Jihadi John parading victims, journalists and humanitarian workers in front of the screen, decapitating them, their videos going viral. You saw Kobani surrounded by ISIS, a city in northern Syria, which is predominantly Kurdish, completely surrounded. The Kurdish fighters there, the YPG, with their backs to the wall, fighting for their very survival. Because if they were to lose, it wasn't a case of them being taken prisoner. It was the utter annihilation of their entire community. If you looked towards Sinjar Mountain, the Yazidi people, who we had already seen paraded through the streets and sold like cattle, were surrounded on Sinjar Mountain. So it was just one story after another coming out of Syria and Iraq, just horrifying us. And I can remember being there thinking to myself, why isn't Britain and America doing anything to help? From the fall of Mosul in Iraq, the second largest city in Iraq, several million people live in Mosul. After the fall of that city, it was 100 days before the US Air Force bombed in support of both the Peshmerga and the Iraqi government. In that 100 days, ISIS spread enormously fast. And again, those 100 days, I was sitting at home. I was working in a job in foreign exchange every day, just like everyone else. I was picking up the newspaper, seeing these journalists, seeing these aid workers in orange jumpsuits, wondering, screaming in my head, why aren't we doing anything? And it was only when the Kurds in Syria called for international volunteers, in the spirit of, I suppose, just like the socialists in Spain called for international volunteers to fight the fascists in the 1930s, the Kurds did exactly the same thing. And I just felt like it was a great opportunity to go out to fight against ISIS, to stand for what is right, what is a conflict between the clearest divide between good and evil, I think, since the 1930s, since the fight against Nazism. ISIS was so clear-cut, the evil ones, that to join the local groups fighting against them, for me, was an easy decision to make. Yeah, so I worked for a small boutique currency house. I'd been working in the industry for a couple of years. First, I suppose, wetting my beak in the industry by working for a bank first, then gradually getting to smaller and smaller brokers, working in more specialized and niche areas of the industry. And I ended my time actually in business development, traveling to Spain and to Portugal and to other European countries, trading predominantly the euro and the pound. And I suppose, if anything, if there's any indication of why I would decide to do this, is my industry was, I suppose, predisposed towards reading the news, understanding the news, what's moving the markets. As I said to you before, what was moving the markets, what was going around the world, what was going viral, was the chaos in the Middle East, was the rise of a terror group that was becoming a state group. It would seize so much territory, an area of land bigger than Cuba, bigger than about the same size as the United Kingdom. Something like 7 million, 8 million people were under their control. tens of thousands of fighters from around the world were creating a literal jihadi army in Syria and Iraq, one that was destroying the local forces of the Iraqi government, the Syrian government, and any community they got in their way. So this was the rise of a fascist organization that there was only one response to them, and that was its complete and utter annihilation. And it was frustrating for me as someone who studied politics, who's a civilian though, who looks at the rise of the chaos in the Middle East and then says to myself, well, the only thing we can do, we can't negotiate these people away. We can't talk to these people and ask them to release the sex slaves or ask them to stop murdering people. We have to hit back. And while I was thinking this, the opposition in the United Kingdom particularly was talking about opening back channels to ISIS, just talking with them, and all these flowery talk of peace meant that we were fiddling while Rome burnt, basically. And it was just a sense of urgency and internationalism that drove me to Syria and Iraq to fight as well. So I initially reached out on Facebook. This, by the way, is a very modern war. It's a very peculiar war, whereby the people who were the most victorious against ISIS, the ones who fought back and actually began to win, weren't the state groups. It wasn't the Iraqi government necessarily, although they did amazing work liberating their own country in Iraq. But and it certainly wasn't the Syrian government. It was actually local forces, indigenous forces that rose up to protect communities. So the YPG had been around for a very long time. They had formed in opposition to Assad, not only in the earliest days of the civil war in Syria, but also before that as well, fighting for the rights of the Kurdish minority in Syria. But it was only when ISIS suddenly exploded out after the fall of Mosul did the YPG consolidate, grow, invest in its frontline fighters and actually start fighting back. So it was the YPG that liberated Kobani, for example. So this group wasn't supported by anyone, certainly no state power anyway, and was completely alone in the fight against ISIS. And they called out for international volunteers. They called out for solidarity. They said, we believe in democracy, we believe in secular values, we believe in feminism. Feminism is a core component of everything they fight for. They have male and female fighters on the front line. And it was just incredibly refreshing to see, in the heart of the Middle East, a conservative region, to see progressive ideals like feminism, like equality between the sexes and within society being discussed so openly and being put forward as the very reason why they're fighting. So I heard the call. I heard them calling out on Facebook for volunteers, and I wrote to them saying to them, look, I'm not a former serviceman, but then again, nor was I supposed, I don't want to compare myself to George Orwell, but certainly many of the other thousands of people that joined the fight against the fascists in Spain, many of them were just ordinary guys and women who just wanted to go out, support local people and fight against fascists. So I wrote back to these people and I said, look, I'm not a serviceman myself, but I'm willing to fight alongside you guys. I'll do whatever you guys do to liberate yourselves and fight ISIS. But more importantly, I think, I've got a history working in politics in the UK. I think I could reach out to the West and be a bit of a bridge between the Kurdish YPG, which at the time, as far as I was concerned, was suffering a bit of a PR problem, a public relations problem. It needed people to hear their story. It needed people to understand what they're fighting for. They needed people in the West to, instead of have this attitude of saying, let's wipe our hands of the Middle East. It's a nightmare there. There's nothing to support. Everything's falling to bits. Why should we, after 10 years of Afghanistan, after 10 years of Iraq fighting against the Baathists and the terrorists there, why should we invest our young men and women into fighting against the Islamic State in Syria and Iraq? We just don't want to do it. This war fatigue had set in. And I wanted people to realize that there is such a thing as a just war, that when you're fighting in pursuit of liberty, when you're fighting in pursuit of common values of decency and humanism and of democracy, then those are values that are worth fighting for. And so I went out there knowing that I wasn't going to be the next Lawrence of Arabia. I wasn't going to be a fighter on the front line that was going to be a huge asset to them, but instead someone who would show them solidarity and help them in their hour of need. And that's what I did. So after reaching out to them on Facebook, they told me to fly first to Sulaymaniyah in northern Iraq, where I would be met by a guy at the airport who would take me to a safe house, and from there transfer me across the border. And I can remember, obviously, on that first trip, being sort of a bit of a bag of nerves, thinking to myself, am I doing the right thing here? Is this an elaborate plot by the Islamic State to capture me, to capture a naive Westerner and lure them out? And it was only when I got there, when I spoke to the Kurds who met me at the airport, who took me to the safe house, then did I realize that not only was I with the right people, but actually they were incredibly well organized. They had already started fighting back in Kobani, and it would be another month before they completely liberated Kobani itself, and Syria and the British were looking at the YPG in a whole new light. They were thinking to themselves, right, after more than 100 days of stunning Islamic State successes in Syria and Iraq, there is one group that's received no funding and no help, no support, is actually winning, is actually fighting back against ISIS and doing a good job, and it's the YPG. So I arrive in Iraq. I get taken to the mountains of northern Iraq, where I'm told for the first time I'm exposed actually to the troubles between even the Kurds themselves, because the Kurds in Iraq and the Kurds in Syria are two different, have two different political ideologies. And the Kurds had actually blocked the border between Syria and Iraq, stopping all supplies from getting in while political negotiations were ongoing. So it took me a couple of days to cross the border, just because if I'd been caught even by the Kurds in Iraq, I would have been arrested and sent back to the United Kingdom. So I waited in the mountains for a couple of days, and then just one evening, it was New Year's Day actually, New Year's Eve, sorry, before 2015, did they take me in a car to the river, to the Euphrates, the Tigris River, I think it's called, and which would flow all the way down to Baghdad. In the middle of the night, we crossed the border, and I think for the first time I was shown what I was getting myself in for, because as I got to the river, ran to the river in the middle of the night, on the opposite bank came boats to pick me up, but before I could get in the boats, injured men and women from Kobani, from other parts of the front line were getting off, and I had to help them to their cars, to get them to hospital. So it was my first taste of actually that I was going into a war zone, that I was getting into one of the bloodiest conflicts of this century, and I would have to be absolutely clear in my head and in my heart that this was the right thing to do. And I got on the boat. I went over.
Did the Kurds provide the military training? I'm assuming they gave you some kind of weapon. And what was their training, or was it literally just, there's a gun, there's the front line?
Well, it was in the early days. It was actually pretty a little bit more amateurish. Let's say that much. It's not a military organization even to this day. That they're still working on consolidating and solidifying who they are as a group and organizing themselves. They're now something like 100,000 people in the YPG and the SDF, the Syrian Democratic Forces, which is the umbrella group for now all the organizations in eastern Syria. But in those early days, it was just the YPG. The SDF didn't exist. And I was taken first to a camp where I was interviewed by Kurdish commanders. Who am I? What did I come for? They thanked me obviously for coming. Incredibly welcoming. The first couple of days, I was meeting tabors, or they call them tabors. They're basically units and platoons of men and women going back and forth from the front line. We sat outside, we sat around fires, we talked, we laughed, them in broken English, me struggling to learn Kurdish. We danced around the fire, which is a very old Kurdish custom. And I was interviewed by the commanders, who basically asked me, what did I want to achieve? And I told them all about public relations and about how they needed to appeal to people in the West and educate people in the West, and how I thought I could do that. And again, they thought that was an excellent idea, and they thanked me for doing that. And in those early days, you only got 1 week of training before they put you on the front line, because this was a fight for survival. This was actually at a time when ISIS was winning. So I was only given 1 week of very rudimentary sort of Kurdish training before I was put on a truck with about 6 or 7 other international volunteers and sent to the front line. Now, the difference is, the thing that I am truly blessed about and thankful for is that in those early days, in sort of January 2015, it was cold, it was wet, it even snowed on my second day there, a light pattering of snow over Syria, which I can remember being utterly confused about because I thought Syria was a hot country and that it wouldn't be cold. But I went to the front line, and ISIS was just a smudge on the horizon. For the first couple of months, we really didn't do much. We were just holding the line, which felt good to a degree, but it wasn't. I'd gone with such expectation that I'd be thrust into a firefight on day one, that I was taken aback at how slow things were starting. But what I didn't realize at the time was that the YPG really was gearing up for the fight back, for the offensive. And there were a few false starts when me and my unit, or Tabor, would get into our vehicles ready to go off to the front line and fight. And then we were quickly pulled back and said, no, let's wait. And in that time, I was able to train with my other international volunteers. So international volunteers from the French Foreign Legion, former guys who were in the US Army, British Army, they'd all come out to Syria to join the YPG and the Kurds. And together, because we all spoke the same language, because we all, many of them were former NATO militaries, they wanted to make sure that that all the sort of calls, all the procedures that they would ultimately use when they finally did get into a fight would actually all gel well together. They wanted to do as much training as possible. So for those first couple of months, I joined in and was able to learn so much more with them than I did in the week that I spent in the Kurdish camp. So, and then just one day, I think it was in late February 2015, that's when the battles started to kick off, and that's when the offensive for a place called Tilhamis kicked off at the end of February.
What kind of weaponry were you using? I mean, just rifles or grenade launchers? What kind of material?
Well, that's the thing, is this is a fight that hasn't been seen in the West for a very long time, and a lot of the former service people who had served in the British Army and the American Army, some of them couldn't quite get to grips with it, and actually some even went home. Because at the end of the day, you were given an AK-47, often a weapon that was much older than you were. The oldest one I saw was made in 1955, this AK-47 that was given to an international volunteer. So with our slightly rusty, battered 30-year-old AKs, we also had a few PKMs, obviously heavy machine guns. We had a couple of us were given Dragunov sniper rifles. So it was all sort of old Soviet weaponry, as you expect in the region and in amongst a militia group. RPG rocket launchers. There were a scattering of Dushkas 50 caliber weapons on the back of Hilux vehicles, back of civilian vehicles. But you also, and the YPG at the time, it was suffering from a real lack of heavy machinery, particularly tanks and APCs, armoured personnel carriers. You did see them around occasionally, and in fact, those units had to work extra hard because whenever there was an operation ongoing on one part of the front line, that unit would then get pulled off once that operation was complete, only to be sent 20 miles down the road to take part in another operation with another set of YPG fighters somewhere else. It would alleviate a little bit better as we progressed on. We'd capture more weapons from ISIS. We'd even capture them from the regime. Weapons would be drip-fed from the coalition and from the Americans and Brits. But in the early days, it was just 3,000, 4,000 Kurdish fighters on one front line, 3,000, 4,000 ISIS fighters on another front line, and often the ISIS guys had more tanks and more artillery than we did. So it was much more like a conventional war than any Western soldier has seen in a long time. There was very little air support. If you were injured, you would have to be helped as best as people could. Particularly if you're found by a Kurdish fighter, they're going to have very little knowledge of on first aid or battlefield aid, and it was just in a very difficult and dangerous environment where the casualties were horrendous to Western standards. It's not unusual for a unit of 40 people to lose sort of 10 dead and 15 wounded in one operation. Sometimes units were so incapacitated with losses that they would be disbanded and absorbed by other units. So Yeah, it was Soviet weaponry against Soviet weaponry, a war from a different age, essentially. Well, in the early days, so the battlefield space sort of evolved over time. So in the early days, it was very much in the countryside. It was in small villages, small towns, and when the Americans were slowly gaining confidence in the YPG, and when the YPG, after about a year after I arrived, formed the SDF, the Syrian Democratic Forces. So they began to embrace peoples, Arabs and Christians and Yazidis from all parts of Syria to join them together fighting for democracy. So it basically, the standard operation went like this, whereby 4,000 Kurds would basically punch through the ISIS front line, typically at 2 points, and they would try and do a pincer movement. And what effectively they were trying to do is, if they came in at a pincer, they would always leave a route out for ISIS to escape, because they didn't want ISIS to fight to the death. They wanted ISIS to withdraw from the areas that they were attacking. Obviously, knowing that ISIS would keep withdrawing until it got to a point where they couldn't withdraw anymore. But what the Kurds wanted to do was keep their losses as low as possible to preserve their strength, keep pushing ISIS out of their territory until it came to the crux point, when it came to the point where ISIS wouldn't retreat anymore, and it was they were fighting to the death from there on. From my experiences, 9 times out of 10, for the first couple of years, whenever ISIS was given an opportunity to escape, actually even towards the very end, they were cowards to the end. They would always try and escape, but they usually took that option. So if two forces were coming together, ISIS would typically scoot out, and then the two YPG forces would meet, and then they would clear the area of territory that they had liberated. They would clear it afterwards, and you might find a scattering of ISIS fighters, some maybe who've thrown down their weapons and are hiding in villages and communities trying to blend in. Others would put up a fight and fight to the death, and they would have to be dealt with separately. But in terms of a cohesive force, ISIS would always typically put up as much resistance as possible. When it became hopeless, then they would scoot and leave. That changed over time, particularly as we got to the larger cities like Manbij and Raqqa. Raqqa is a city of like 400,000 people, 300,000 people. It's a large, big place with an industrial zone, a residential zone, there's commercial districts, and it was very much like Stalingrad, where they had like 4 years to prepare. They dug trenches in all of the streets. All the buildings had tunnels between them. Every building was a fortification. Every street was a barricade, and there were mines, thousands of mines everywhere. You couldn't every building you went into, every fridge you opened, every cupboard you opened, every door you opened, every bit of congregated iron or whatever's on the ground that might mask a bomb, they were just everywhere. And hundreds of people died in Raqqa alone just from the IEDs. So it started off as a conventional war, won at distance, where we would call in a lot of airstrikes, weaken the ISIS defenders, would move in. ISIS would typically retreat after some heavy losses. And then it got towards the end in the cities where it was chaotic and people would die randomly. And actually the numbers of casualties increased drastically. So, a very challenging environment, to say the least.
What were the Kurds like to fight alongside? I get the impression they weren't kind of hugely trained, but were they very motivated, kind of committed to the cause?
So the Kurds themselves they're fantastic fighters. The average, I'm often asked actually by people who say, weren't you more of a baggage to them as a Western volunteer, someone who's got no experience? And I often say to them, look, you've got to remember these are Kurdish boys and girls, many of whom are sort of 18 years old, 19 years old. They've come from their communities, their villages, with no military experience. Often they've never even picked up a rifle. They're given 1 week of training. They're put in a uniform, and they are packed off to the front line. And this was a fight for their very survival. And the only way I could possibly compare it to the UK is during the First World War. And you even had young British boys going up to the recruitment office and being literally 15 years old, not old enough to fight. And the recruitment office very much turning to them and saying, I can remember a couple of stories when I was at school of the recruitment office saying to the boy, look, how old are you? 15. Okay, I'll tell you what, why don't you go for a run, have a think about it, come back, and I'm sure you'll be 18. And these boys would go out and they'd come back and they'll be 18, and then they'll be packed off to the front line after just a couple of weeks training. Because Britain was at threat of invasion. We were about to lose everything. And this was, and it was amazing to see all the British people come together, queues forming up around the block to defend our country. That's exactly what happened in Kurdistan. These are young Kurdish men and women who just wanted to protect their homes because they knew if they lost, if the YPG was defeated, then not only would their homes, their buildings be destroyed and annihilated, their culture would be destroyed, their women would be sold into sexual slavery, the men and boys would be lined up in ditches and shot in the head in mass graves. This was a fight for their very survival, and there was nothing going to stop them from defending their homes. So the people that I met were incredibly inspirational. They were just ordinary men and women. Some would be university educated, others were just from the villages where they had been herding sheep all their lives. But all of them had come together, put on the uniform to fight back. And it was also incredibly refreshing. And I can remember taking loads of videos of what things that these people were coming out with and saying that they love the West, that they were born under Assad in Syria, under a dictator. They had been given no rights as Kurds in Syria. Now they're fighting for their very survival from ISIS. The Assadist troops have fled from their area and basically left them to the wolves. And this was, and now it's up to them and their community to protect themselves. No one else will help them. And so to hear these young people say, I want democracy. I want my children in the future to go to university and to travel the world, and all the things that we aspire to in Britain, they wanted. And I just wanted people in the West to understand that. And that's why I got my camera out. That's why I interviewed people. So, yeah, the Kurds were a remarkable people, a very kind people, and they welcomed me and all the other international volunteers from day one.
Did the Kurds really understand ISIS? Did they know where this came from, or were they just completely bemused by it, or confused by the whole thing? Or what was kind of the Kurdish attitude towards ISIS?
Well, they despised the Kurds are quite a unique people in Syria. So unique for the region. So they're not overwhelmingly religious for a start, and many of them are open atheists. There's obviously the Kurds weren't alone in creating the SDF, the Syrian Democratic Forces. Sunni Arabs would also join. Christians would also join. Yazidis, who have their own ancient religion, would also join. So the Kurds from day one wanted to create an organization that would embrace all these peoples. And that would be secular in nature, that everyone was fighting for their own community and for their own faith, if that's what they were fighting for. But as part of the organization, they were part of an organization that was all-encompassing and all-embracing. So the Kurds themselves, they recognized that ISIS was born from a number of different things. ISIS is humanity at its very lowest, basically. It's an extreme twisted version of the religion of the Islamic faith, but it's also a power grab by people who are intent on disrupting Syria and Iraq for their own personal gain. A good example of that is the number of Saddam generals, former Ba'athist members of Saddam's military who joined ISIS. Saddam, for all his brutality and the horrors that he committed, he was actually mostly a secular president. He did bizarre things like he wrote the Quran in his own blood, but he was also largely a secular president that allowed Christians, etc., to live and often thrive in Iraq. So how did these Iraqi generals survive and live under a largely secular dictator, yet when democracy comes to Iraq, suddenly find God and want to join an extreme fringe of their religion, which is the Islamic State. So many people are joining for many different reasons, and these people are intent on murder, on rape, on chaos. And the godfather of ISIS, the very godfather, the person who really birthed everything that ISIS would later become, was a guy called Zarqawi, a particularly foul Islamist fanatic who was formerly part of Al-Qaeda, but created Al-Qaeda in Iraq against the Americans after the invasion in 2003. And Zarqawi, he birthed the idea of terror as being a great unifier of the peoples that would eventually become the Islamic State. He birthed the idea of attacking schools, of attacking children, which in the West is illogical. It's fanatical and barbaric and disgusting, but it's also illogical because you think to yourself, but that's just going to unify people against you. Why is ISIS parading all these journalists and humanitarian workers on TV and cutting off their heads? Why are they selling girls into slavery, all the rest of it? The reason they want to do it is they want to strike fear, intense fear into people. So much fear that they're incapacitated, that they don't know exactly what to do. And more than that, by striking fear between communities and wedging themselves between communities, it turns communities against each other, which can even involve young Shia lads or young Christian lads or young people in the West who attack Sunni Muslims, accusing them of being ISIS, and then just driving those people who are ordinary good people towards ISIS. So it's just about recruitment. It's about inciting terror. So yeah, I mean, the Islamic State was birthed from a number of different things. The Kurds recognized that, but more importantly, they recognized what they needed to do when it came to opposing them, and being the very opposite of ISIS was the best way to do that. Being the secular democratic force in Syria was the unifying point that all people could rally to. So yeah, it was inspiring to be alongside them.
What were ISIS actually like in battle? I mean, were they competent? Were they very fanatical, or were they quite cowardly? What was ISIS like to fight?
ISIS would sometimes be incompetent, often incompetent. What their biggest success, though, bizarrely, because they were as ill-trained as almost everyone else was in the conflict, certainly as much as myself. But what they had was their fanaticism, which was actually a very good asset for them, because if you're particularly if you're facing the conscript armies of the Iraqi government, the Syrian government, who don't want to be there. They often don't believe in what they're fighting for. They're forced to fight. They're often led by donkeys as well, who often would flee before them, leaving them leaderless, etc. And what ISIS were very good at were, although they were not particularly well trained, they, in the early days, did have plenty of weapons. They had pretty solid leadership that punished dissent by executing people who ran away or anything else. And often the vanguard, the SS of ISIS, are the most fanatical, often the foreign fighters as well. And this is often something that I say to people in the West. There's a debate in the UK at the moment about whether we should invite British people who had joined ISIS as volunteers, whether we should invite them back. Perhaps give them a slap on the wrist. Maybe they might end up in jail for 5 years, but largely try and reintegrate them back into British society. There's genuine people trying to do that at the moment. And I often say to them, look, you do realize these people are the SS of ISIS. They are so fanatically committed that they've traveled 1,000 miles to join them. They've fought from the very birth of the so-called caliphate to its demise in Baghouz, in the final battles against the SDF and the Kurds. So they were captured reluctantly at the very end. to say to yourself, right, well, but they were young when they went, they might have psychological problems, etc., is to really miss the point of exactly who the victims are here and who the aggressors are, and also who the most vulnerable people are here and who the people we need to be keeping away from society. So the SS of ISIS, these international volunteers, were often at the very front. They didn't care if they lived or died. The conscript armies of Syria and Iraq would often flee in front of them because they were leaderless and scared. And it was only when they bumped up against an organization that actually believed in what they were fighting for as much as them, which is democracy, which is secularism, which is their homes, which is their livelihoods, did they suddenly start to lose. And I mean, there's a famous ISIS saying, which I actually also use, believe it or not. They say all the time, as if it's a good thing, they say, we value death, we love death as much as you love life. And I often use that phrase as well to remind people what we're fighting against. I literally say, you do realize that these people like death as much as we love life. It literally is the exact same thing, but they mean it in a totally different way. And the Kurds, they believe in life. They believe in life and democracy, in protecting their homes as much as ISIS believed in death, because they are a death cult. So that's when they started to lose, because they were coming up against an immovable force. And it was just an honor for me as an international volunteer to be there and to witness it. No, you'd often, to be honest, I never met any foreign jihadis. I would find their letters, I would live in their homes, and I would actually later give some solid evidence to Western nations, particularly, well, I won't say which nation it was, but I would give whatever evidence I had of international volunteers that I found, whether it was letters or documents that I found, take photos of it, and then immediately, as soon as I got back to the UK, send it to where it needed to go. But I never actually met an international volunteer for ISIS up front in the face. I met plenty who were locals, or maybe they were foreigners and I just didn't realize. They could have been from Libya, of course. They could have been from Egypt, and I had no idea. Or if they were from the West, they certainly never spoke to me. But the vast majority that I found were just people hiding amongst the hiding as we moved on operation. We mustn't forget that there was thousands of ISIS fighters. This was a conventional army. And if there's a massive operation ongoing that covers hundreds of square kilometers and there are thousands of participants on both sides, of course, people will be left behind. People will try and surrender. So you would often capture these people, and all I did was, well, we handcuffed them, put them on the back of trucks and sent them behind the lines to go to the big jails that the Kurds were building behind the line. And I think some of them were shocked when we put a bottle of water in their hands, and shocked that they weren't being dragged to the side of the road and executed like they would often do to us if they captured us. And again, it's just another sign of the clear distinctions between the groups here and what side is which one's the good side, which one's the evil side. And I would see plenty of ISIS fighters dead, far more dead actually than lived, because ISIS would much prefer, if they survived, to run the other way than to come our way. So even if they were being roundly defeated, you would occasionally capture them, you would mostly kill them, but any survivors would scooting and running back behind their lines. It became quite a problem for ISIS. In fact, after an operation in a place called I think Gillespie, I can't remember what it's called now, in an operation in northern Syria, some 70 ISIS fighters were executed on the streets of Raqqa as an example to the rest of them to stop retreating in front of the YPG. But it was that shows the effectiveness of the tactic, was even how fanatically committed the Islamic State was. As the Kurds always left, as they squeezed around them, as the bull horns came in, they always left an avenue for the ISIS fighters to escape. And as I said, largely 9 times out of 10, these ISIS fighters, no matter how fanatically committed they are, would often go for it. So, yeah.
Yeah, so did you have to worry about like sort of suicide bombers? If ISIS might leave behind someone, and they tend to surrender, but they'd actually bomb them.
Yeah, so ISIS, yeah, absolutely. Everyone who was captured from ISIS would be forced to strip take their tops off, certainly, to hide anything. I lost a good friend of mine, Havachir, who a Kurdish man who was clearing a building. And he came to the very center of the building, and there was a man in there without a weapon. And he said, please, please, don't shoot me, don't shoot me. And he put his weapon down just as the guy detonated his suicide vest. And it not only destroyed that room, but brought down the entire building. That's how big the suicide vest was. So not only killing the ISIS guy, but killing Chia and several other people who had also gone into the building. So these guys are fanatics. They can't be trusted. They not only use suicide vests, which we would find, the belts packed with explosives and nuts and bolts also to spread the shrapnel. They would also use vehicles to great effect. They were actually quite innovative in the horrors that they would come up with. Things that would become a particular nuisance to us was not only the fact that 1 in every 3 ISIS fighter typically wore a suicide vest. So even if they're dead or close to death, they would be lying on the ground ready to pull the pin in the last moments. But also they would have drones in the sky, which commercial civilian drones that have been modified to drop bombs. There'd also be civilian vehicles crammed with explosives and driven towards our lines, which is something that I dealt with on a few occasions in Syria. They would also do things like hide amongst the civilian population, and they did that very effectively. And they would even dress up as women in burqas and everything else. So they would do anything they possibly could to spread fear and incite horror amongst people. There were several occasions in Manbij where something like 100 refugees were fleeing the city. And ISIS, what they did was they infiltrated the 100 or 150 or so refugees with suicide bombers. And then they shot above their heads. They started shooting at the refugees. They shot maybe 1 or 2 of them. And that caused all of the refugees to come stampeding down the streets, running for their lives. And in and amongst them were the suicide bombers. And that would cause chaos because the Kurds would be waving these people down saying, stop, 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 we need to sort you out. We need to check all of you for bombs. And people would be running past them and they don't know exactly who's got the bomb or not. And then bang, it would go off. So they did anything they could to kill, and they didn't care who they killed to do it, whether it was civilians, women or children or whatever. So you're fighting fanatics, essentially. So yeah, the drones were modified quite well. They weren't as, people did die from them and people were injured from them quite often, but actually they weren't as dangerous as a conventional mortar or other explosives that would be raining around you.
Dropping explosives, or did they kind of fly into you packed with explosives?
Oh no, they would typically actually drop. So they were building, funnily enough, in Raqqa I found a drone factory, and they were building drones for both reconnaissance and to be sort of suicide drones which would crash into you. But actually the vast majority of their drones were quadcopters, sort of with the 4 propellers, civilian drones, which there's a particular brand, but I won't say it, that they would buy, and they're very capable drones, which they would be able to carry maybe 2 or 3 bombs. But to do that, they had to be as light as possible. So these bombs would typically be bottles, old plastic bottles of water with a shotgun shell at the bottom filled with plastic explosive, maybe a few little bits of metal, but to be honest with you, what they were relying on was the detonation of the plastic explosive to kick up the dust and kick up the stones, etc., to do the damage, because it was just too heavy for them to pack it with metal. So, but what that meant, as I said before, is they were less dangerous than a conventional mortar. So I've had people I've been targeted by drone bombs. I've had people next to me targeted. I've seen people injured, but with a splattering of shrapnel. I've seen no one killed, although I have heard of people killed. But I've also seen people who've had drone bombs land within just a few meters of them, and they've been completely fine, except for an enormous bang, and nothing actually happened to them at all, not even a cut. So but what was scary about those things was the sheer quantity of them. In Raqqa, they would bomb us every single day for hours and hours and hours. And there was very little we could do to stop them, because these things would fly up incredibly high. They'd drop the bombs, which would have foam tail fins, and they would drop like a shuttlecock from these drones, and they would just land around us. And occasionally they would get lucky and they would injure someone, or in other parts of the front line maybe kill them. But largely it was just a real nuisance, because what it did was it kept us off the roof. And that's not a good thing to do in Raqqa, because the roof is a place of overwatch. It's a place of, it gives you height to shoot down on people who attack you. And if you're constantly being bombed and kept off the roof by ISIS, and they're constantly attacking with ground forces as well, it means that there's more confusion, etc. And there's nothing more terrifying than the dull drone of a drone above your head, thinking to yourself, any second now there's going to be a huge bang next to me. But ISIS were very sophisticated in other things, particularly the use of suicide vehicles, which they would hide in Raqqa. So Raqqa, they would, a building, civilian building, from the sky look normal. They'd even be washing on the line, but underneath the bottom floor would be utterly gutted and driven into the front line, and a huge door smashed into the front of the house, and a huge suicide vehicle just left there. And the idea is, as we got closer, and sometimes they would prepare them months in advance, so that these houses were miles away from the front line, but as the front line got closer, within 100 yards of that building, a suicide bomber could climb in, start the vehicle, drive out. He's only got 100 meters to go to the front line, and it's much less likely for him to be seen by an American drone, which was constantly patrolling towards the end, looking out for suicide vehicles which were being built and driven to the front line so they could bomb them. So these were actually a way for them to cut that out and make sure that their suicide vehicles were getting to us sometimes on a daily basis.
Inside these things.
Yeah, I saw videos of them trying to create driverless vehicles, but the only way they could effectively do that was to actually have the driverless vehicle be an automatic vehicle. So again, that means that there's less of a pool of vehicles for them to use. Also, the effort in which they had to put to make these things, and often the horror and the beauty of having a person inside the suicide vehicle is they're adaptable. So as they're driving towards us, if they see that we've blocked a road, they can spin around and they can go down a different road. They can get stuck in a hole. They can stick it into first gear and really rev the engine and get it out of whatever hole we've dug for them. So these people are much more capable than a machine. And actually, at the end of the day, a lot more disposable. They had thousands of fanatics willing to blow themselves up. For them, it was like, well, it's much better to use the odd kamikaze than to put the effort into doing it autonomously and through drone technology. Well, the Kurds weren't necessarily that good, if I'm honest. There were specialist tabors looking out for mines and decommissioning mines, and they did an amazing job. The casualty rate amongst them was pretty high. The average Kurdish fighter, I should say, it depended who they were and their personality. Some were overly cautious, others just didn't really know the risks, and you would try and tell them, but it would often fall on deaf ears, because sometimes in an operation you're going through Raqqa. You take an apartment building, and it's very difficult to get food and water between buildings and from the supply lines right up to the frontline fighters. So often it wasn't unusual for a Kurdish fighter to be in a house, to bed down. He might be there for 48 hours. He might think to himself, I'm so safe here, I'm absolutely fine. And then he thinks to himself, I'm so damn hungry, I'm going to go into the kitchen and see if there's any dried pasta. And all he does is open a cupboard or open the fridge. They loved putting them in fridges. Or sometimes you'd go into a room and you'd check the light, you'd pull the light switch, or you'd walk into another part of the building, and there'll be maybe a carpet on the ground or a bit of bit of iron or a wardrobe that's fallen over, and you don't realize when you move the wardrobe out of the way, or if you try and stand on the wardrobe to get to the window or to move through a building, that actually underneath the wardrobe is a massive IED that's going to detonate and destroy half the building. They would often put them in stairwells as well, knowing that we would be going up the stairwells, and often they would be more than halfway up, so try and get as much of the patrol into the stairwell as possible, and then it would detonate, and often the stairwell would collapse. So there were thousands and thousands. Often I would be in a building and they would go off randomly because the heat of the day, if they've just buried a recent IED, the heat of the day would shrink the earth and they would just detonate. So you'd be sitting on the side of the road in an area that you think is safe, and then suddenly, bang, down the road, there's an enormous explosion that spews dust and smoke into the road. And you think, that's strange. I didn't hear a mortar whistle in. That was an RPG? No, I don't think so. And then you start to the horrifying realization that just amongst the rubble is unexploded bombs and stuff. Then it makes you even more cautious. And at the end of the day, I was only really responsible for myself. I educated people as much as I could. I was like, the best way to describe myself in Raqqa particularly was, have you ever seen a rat or a mouse on an Attenborough documentary who's in his hole? He comes out a little bit, he stops, he sniffs the air, his eyes dart around, he comes out a little bit more, and all of a sudden, the slightest inclination that there's a hawk above him, he darts straight back in and he's gone. That constant state of awareness, although grinding on your mind and could really affect you eventually, was one of the main ways which I know that I survived in Raqqa, that I was just so cautious. And there were times where you just couldn't, that all the pre-planning, all the forethought in the world would not stop you from getting shot, because there were some times where you just had to cross that road. You knew there was someone shooting down it, but your guys were on the other side, or the food was on the other side, or the operation was sending you in that direction, and all you had to do was just run across it and just hope to God that you do so quickly, and while the ISIS sniper is scratching his head or whatever. So yeah, I mean, the book is my experience in Syria was over 3 years. 3 years of sniper fire, of sitting around campfires singing and dancing, or 3 years of boring guard duty, 3 years of friendship, 3 years of loss, and putting that in a book that would ultimately be 85,000 words long was incredibly difficult. And it meant that I had to really choose what I put in and what I didn't. And sometimes I would have to choose incidences and examples of things that happened to me in the book as examples that happened to me all the time. So instead of taking 10 examples of nearly being shot, I just make it one and make it absolutely clear that was a close call. So yeah, I mean, it wasn't one thing I wouldn't want people to go away, though, from the book or from our discussion now, is to think that fighting in Syria was constant and all the time. It was so boring occasionally. 90% of the time, all you're doing in Raqqa, for example, is sitting on a roof, getting sniper shots, getting mortared and all the rest of it. And occasionally, every week or so, ISIS would try and break out. You'd shoot into the dark. They'd be shooting at you. There'd be an RPG would hit the building next to you. But largely, you'd call in an airstrike, and they'd get absolutely obliterated in whatever building they'd managed to sneak into. And then the front line would go quiet again. And then another 2 weeks will pass. 3 weeks will pass. And in that 4 weeks, you've only shot your weapon once, actually, because ISIS left their front line once. It was only when we went on an operation did we lose people. Did we really? And you spent all those 4 weeks begging for an operation. Oh, I'm so bored, I've got to do something. And then when you're on that operation, you spend your entire time, or at least I did, begging for the quietness of the front line. So it was a very challenging environment. Yeah, so airstrikes towards the end, particularly the last couple of years, it was up to the Kurds to call it in. So we were given apps on our phones and devices as well to actually find GPS coordinates, very easy ways to identify exactly where the Islamic State positions were just by visualizing them, seeing them, finding them on a map, calling in the coordinates, and often they would first maybe have a look first with a drone, and then they'd airstrike. Or often, if we're really under pressure, just simply airstrike straight away. So that was something that we got in time. American and drones and British aircraft and French aircraft were over Syria and Iraq all the time. In Raqqa, you would look up and you'd see 7 planes in the sky. And in the vast expanse of the sky, you'd see like 7 planes at one time going around. One might clearly be identified as a drone. Another, you might see, oh, that's an F-16. Oh, that's a Warthog with the chain gun at the front, ready to swoop in and blast the ISIS positions. And at all times over the city, they dropped hundreds of explosives. Because ISIS, there was thousands of them. They had mortar pits disguised in parks, in the stadium and in the hospital. They had bunkers where command and control points. They had mini hospitals underground to cure their fighters and bring places for them to rest and to sleep. And these things were being found constantly through intelligence. Every time their radios were used in a particular location, the Americans were constantly pinpointing targets. Often civilians would be leaving areas and they'd be able to say, oh, on the corner of 10th Street, there's a command bunker underneath near the mosque, and then the Americans would then find it and blow it up. So there was constant intelligence at all times. There was constant drone activity, and that took the pressure off the front line. That took the huge amount of pressure off the Kurds. That meant, obviously, that didn't mean, obviously, that when we went on operation, that things wouldn't go badly for us, because just with the nature of the fighting. But the amount of airstrikes and the amount of support that the Kurds were getting on the front line was absolutely amazing. So there were people on the ground. I largely kept myself to myself. I knew I've often, when you compare, because the only people who are there are former Navy SEALs, the SES, they're deployed, the creme de la creme of the armed forces of the West. And I've often, as a joke, I once said that putting me next to an SES soldier is like putting a 3-legged donkey in the Kentucky Derby. It's just, they don't mix, and they don't want to mix. I don't want to mix. I'm there as an international volunteer to show my international support, and I know these guys are there for a job, and I respect them so much. And occasionally, I did interact with them. There is a reason why I left it out of the book. One is I was at one point I was asked by a service person from the UK, just because we met by chance. He just simply said, "Oh, can you not tell anyone that we met?" And although I'm telling you now, and that's a bit of an open secret because there was other international volunteers there, I've kept true to that, and I have no intention of speaking about the kind of people that I met and why they were there. I think that's up to the government to explain. But I think for me, as an international volunteer, I was just relieved to see that with growing confidence, as the Kurds were fighting back against ISIS, that they were receiving this support. Because in those early days, they weren't there. There was no British guys, there was no American guys on the ground helping the Kurds. I didn't see one. And then after about 6 months, 7 months, I see my first one. And then gradually towards the end of the conflict, they're everywhere. They're gelled in with the SDF, they're working hand in glove, and they're supporting each other, they're defeating ISIS, and there's a real chance that they can bring democracy to Syria. And I was overjoyed to see it. And that's what I wanted. That's all I wanted from the very beginning. And it's got nothing to do with me. I think it's got everything to do with the Kurds impressing the West. And I'm just so glad that history went in that direction, and that the Kurds did receive the support that they needed because they won, and it worked.
It's very interesting. You mentioned that YPG was getting support from Western governments. At the same time, I know international volunteers such as yourself sometimes had legal problems, so in particular in the UK. So I think there's a couple of cases. I think it was David Burke who charges were dropped against him last week. And there's a guy called Aidan Jones who was found guilty. I don't know if he's still in prison. I'm not quite sure his status is. I mean, to me that seems utterly perverse, but any of you guys are having trouble. I mean, did you ever have any problems when you came back to the UK with the security services or the police?
No, I didn't. Well, they've tried over several years to bring prosecutions, and they've been very close, actually, through a friend of mine in the legal profession. Even I was looked into to see whether or not a prosecution could be brought. In the end, it was abandoned, clearly, because there was none was. And I went 3 times to Syria. And at each time, they didn't attempt to stop me. The only thing they asked me to do was to simply sign a document saying, look, they've spoken to me, they've advised me of the law, and they want to make it absolutely clear to me that if I am captured by ISIS, that they are not responsible to come and get me or anything like that. And that which was absolutely fine. I signed it each time. And every time I interacted with the police, I was so supportive. I was told them everything. Here's my devices. I'll give you the password. This is what I'm doing. This is why I'm doing it. And it actually made me even more appreciative of all the work that they do, because not only do I admire them for many different reasons, but I know that these people are just trying to keep the UK safe. I do have criticism for the Crown Prosecution Service and even the Attorney General of the UK, several of them over the years, on why they've brought prosecutions. But the police themselves are remarkable, and they've always given me the chance to explain myself. I'm stopped under Schedule 7 of the Anti-Terrorism Act, which is the right not to remain silent. It's to answer questions and to deem whether or not I'm a threat. Each time, I presume they've deemed I'm not a threat, and I've been allowed to carry on with my business. The legal situation for anyone going to Syria is very vague and complicated. It's a little bit more clear-cut with ISIS, because ISIS is a listed terror group, but the YPG is not. It's not a terror group. It's actually a valued ally of the United Kingdom. But the anti-terrorism laws are so vague that if you join a cause, a political cause, and fight for it and commit violence abroad for that cause, you can be liable for prosecution. And if you receive training as well and other things. So there are little gaps in the legislation. And that's where the police or the Crown Prosecution Service has tested the legislation. They have arrested international volunteers and they have brought them to trial. And each time they've been thrown out. There's not a single person who has been successfully prosecuted for joining the YPG and fighting against ISIS. There's only been one case where a young man called Aiden was successfully prosecuted, and he received 2 jail terms. One was actually spending time in a place called Macer camp in Iraq, where the PKK has operatives, and also he had a drug conviction as well, which extended his sentence. My issue with Aiden's case was simply that it was a bit Walter Mitty-ish. He went to Iraq trying to get to Syria to join the YPG to fight with them. And on his road there, he stopped at Macer camp, which was a place where the PKK operates, and he took photos of himself in the camp with people in PKK uniforms, or that's what supposedly was there. And because of that reason, because of that little hook, even though he didn't fight there, he didn't train there, he wasn't in uniform himself, and he only was there for a few weeks and then left to join the YPG, but because of those diary entries and because of those photos taken, he was then successfully prosecuted. And I think that shows you how vague the laws are, how dangerous they are, and that's why I would never recommend anyone doing what I did or anyone did in Syria and Iraq or any war zone around the world, because you can get into so much trouble, and it's so vague that it's almost impossible to determine in a war zone whether you're doing something legal or not. So it's not advisable. But I think with so many unsuccessful prosecutions of YPG fighters, it got to the point that the CPS was standing up in court saying, let's be clear, we are not trying to prosecute anyone who joins the YPG to fight ISIS. So I think that's key here, because I've only ever joined the YPG, I've only ever joined the SDF, I'm not fighting for a political ideology, I'm just fighting to protect people. And I've been very open and honest with the police, and I've always kept myself clean in that way. So very difficult, very dangerous, and I would hope that the Crown Prosecution Service and the British government takes a look at UK laws and stiffens them in some areas. So anyone who joins the Islamic State is proven to be a member of a terrorist organization that cuts off people's heads and rapes women, that they feel the full force of the law. But people who join groups fighting against terrorism, that fight for what could be deemed legitimate reasons, or could be deemed as a reason that doesn't affect the UK, because you've got to remember, it's not like we were joining a non-listed group that was fighting an ally of the United Kingdom. I would understand that, because if we were fighting against Turkey or even Syria, even Syria, even though Syria is an enemy of the United Kingdom, the YPG never fought the Syrian governments. We only fought terrorists. So I think that's an important distinction to make. So I really hope that all prosecutions from now on against people who join the SDF, who join the YPG, will be dropped, will not be pursued, and they will see them as quite... as harmless people, as people who just want to do good, and the people who went for the illegitimate and dangerous and horrible reasons will actually feel the full force of the law.
Anyone who's going to fight against ISIS has legal consequences for giving you guys medals. I mean, obviously you've alluded to this. There was a big issue with British nationals going to fight for ISIS. In fact, probably far more went to fight for ISIS than against ISIS, and there's something like 600 or 700, I think, and that may be a conservative estimate. We're not really sure. And I mean, they're travelling halfway across the world at great risk to join a kind of genocidal death cult. And my understanding is that some of them have been allowed to return to the UK pretty much without legal sanction. I mean, doesn't it just seem completely illogical to you that people going to fight against ISIS are being prosecuted, and that ISIS fighters have managed to reintegrate into the UK without sanction?
Yeah, just 1 in 10 ISIS fighters and jihadi fighters in Syria who went to Syria, fought and came back to the UK, just 1 in 10 have been successfully prosecuted. That means already there are hundreds of people who have received ideological and military training in Syria and who are fighting for groups that despise the West, despise our country. These people are despise every value that you and I and everyone at home has. Yet they are allowed to go free. Yet international volunteers, Dan Burke, his name is, who was just recently released. He was a former service person. He served our country, and he goes out to Syria to fight against the Islamic State, a terror group. He's, as far as I'm aware, has no previous convictions. Is a very sound guy. Is a very normal bloke. Yet he spends 7 months in jail in a high security prison, without trial, by the way, as well, before he even goes to trial. And the trial has now been cut off. They've decided not to pursue the trial, despite the fact they put a young man, a former service person, a decent bloke in jail for 7 months and turned his life upside down, upsetting his family and causing financial hardship. They're willing to do that. Yet hundreds of international volunteers who joined ISIS receive no punishment. And at the moment, there are dozens of international fighters from Britain waiting to come back to the UK. People like Shamima Begum, people like Jack Letts. And the British government knows how horrible and how difficult it will be to successfully prosecute these people. They know that it will cause an outcry in the UK from people who will be terrified. That it takes one of these people to go into a school with a knife, or to build a bomb and put it on an underground train. It just takes, what do we owe these people for us to take that risk? And the British government instead, though, is taking the decision to just simply wipe its hands and say, right, we're not going to do anything. We're not going to support the Kurds. We're not going to fund their prisons. We're not going to help them build a judicial process to try these people. We're just going to put our fingers in our ears and just focus on Brexit and our other issues and just draw a line under this one. The difficult thing with that is it feeds the human rights lawyers who say that these people are being held without trial and by a third party, and that we should be doing more, and increases the likelihood that eventually through the courts of some other process might mean that these people might come back to the UK anyway. But also, it means that the Kurds, the very people who fought to liberate their own country and lost 12,000 fighters in the process, the very people that I fought alongside and helped as much as I possibly could, they've been left with the financial burden of feeding something like 70,000 ISIS men and women and their children who've been captured since the fall of the caliphate. 70,000 people. It costs millions of pounds every month to guard them, to house them, to clothe them, to feed them, to provide them with adequate medical care. And all the while, there are humanitarian organizations criticizing them, saying, oh, the children should receive more education, the houses should be of better quality, etc. Yet no aid organizations are helping. Britain and America aren't helping. And it's just incredibly frustrating, because we have a real chance here for Britain, which has a huge aid budget. And if we're going to have a £12 billion aid budget, instead of I don't know, giving free credit cards out to people and allowing them to take £200 out of ATMs and whatever. There's other failed programs like giving, putting Wi-Fi in bizarre places. Instead of spending billions of pounds on useless projects, we can actually spend just a few £1 million on securing tens of thousands of fanatical jihadists that have hit us in places like London Bridge, in Manchester, and our kids in Manchester were blown up by these people. And you're saying that you're not willing to give hundreds of millions of pounds or a few £1 million to the very people holding 70,000 of these people in jails? It's just madness. It's madness, because all it takes is the human rights lawyers to successfully bring back 30 or 40 fanatics back to the UK. They all get a slap on the wrist. Within a few years, they're back on the streets, and it just takes one of them to do something horrendous, or it takes a mass breakout of 2,000, 3,000 fighters from a camp to restart the violence in Syria. Remember, all these attacks from Manchester to London were all planned in Raqqa. They were all funded from Raqqa. So allowing these people to get another foothold in the Middle East would be a disaster. So until we get to grips with that as a country, we will never see the end of ISIS, and we'll never see peace in the region. So I hope another thing that I try and do, and what I've always tried to do, is just educate the West on the risks in the Middle East, who the good guys are, who the bad guys are, and what we should be doing, and try and make it clear for everybody.
But yes, obviously there's all these 600 or 700 British nationals who went out of their way to join ISIS. I mean, it wasn't like joining, getting a job at a local supermarket. They've been smuggled into Syria. They've probably at great cost. So it must be something they really, really wanted to do, to join an ideology which we both regard as utterly evil. And what do you think about those people? And what do you think it says about us as a country that we produce them?
I think it's a stain on the UK. I genuinely think Britain needs to evaluate what country we have, and what country and what kind of society we want to live in. Because I feel like we're so polarized at the moment. It's not just because of Brexit, and it's not just because of the direction in which political parties are going at the moment. I think we've been a bit of a polarized country for a number of years. It's just been bubbling under the surface, and I think it's just completely been thrown out into the open in more recent years. And I genuinely would hope that people would reflect on the fact that, yeah, your conservative estimates say sort of 800 to 1,000. Maximum estimates could go up to as much as 2,000 young British men went to go fight in Syria. Well, that's at one point, more people were joining the Islamic State from the Muslim community than were joining the British Army. So, I mean, we've got to evaluate, okay, what are British values? What are British ideals? How can we create a unified vision of our country and of the future? And we must really come together, because the world is actually a very, and most people know this, is a very scary place. And it's getting worse. The effects of climate change, the effects of dwindling resources, of rising powers. In just a few years, the United States will be surpassed by China as not only the largest economy in the world, but most likely the most powerful country in the world as well. And what world are we going to live in when the dominant sole superpower of the world is a horrendous dictatorship that has social credit, that has concentration camps for Uyghurs and for other Muslim communities? We've got to evaluate what kind of society we are now, what our past is, and what our future could be. And the best way we can do that is to have some sort of unified vision. And that it comes through education, it comes through a variety of different means. And I would hope that our country lives up to that challenge, that great challenge of the century, and goes for it and does something about it, because the risks are enormous. And I was just gutted to see that there was one case a few years ago where a son of a Labour councillor was caught trying to get on a plane. Not only he was caught actually in Turkey, I believe. He was on his way to join the Islamic State. He was stopped by the Turkish authorities and brought back to the United Kingdom. We never heard from him again. Presumably, he didn't actually face any jail time for his attempts to join the Islamic State. But what does that show about him as a person and about the people who join ISIS. These people saw the Yazidi girls being sold. They saw the men and boys being gunned down in ditches. They saw Syria and Iraq burning. They saw the black flag of jihad over Syria and Iraq, and they saw people being decapitated in the name of religion. It is an utterly foul ideology that is perverse and the very lowest any human being can go. Yet these people were willing to sacrifice their life, their livelihood, the lovely things they have in the West, to get on a flight and go over and join these people. The intent was there. The intent to join in with the genocide was there. So even people who show commitment to joining Islamic State fundamentalists and are only stopped by the intervention of security services, even they should face years in jail and years of de-radicalization, because the risk is we save these people as much as we can. We stop them from joining terror groups, we stop them from blowing themselves up, we slap them on the wrist on each occasion, but then we lose track of them eventually, or we allow them to slip through the net. The fact that Salman Abedi, the man who blew himself up in Manchester, his family had ties with Islamists. They came back and forth from Libya, which was a war zone. There was many opportunities for him to be identified as a fanatic and dealt with in a very strict and realistic way. Yet he slipped through the net, and who paid the consequences? Was it 20, 30 young girls died? So unless we get to grips with this problem and tackle it in a very serious way, then we could lose. It could only get worse, is all I'm saying. Well, Turkey is very unreliable, in short, and operates entirely outside of the coalition. The coalition is the group of nations from all around the world who were brought together to fight against ISIS and bring peace and stability to Syria and Iraq. Turkey operates entirely out of the coalition and does its own thing, which I think says a lot. If you look at Syria over the past few years, over nearly a decade now, you'll actually see a country that's been ripped apart by a proxy war. I often describe Syria as like a blanket, and on each corner of the blanket is a different dog, whether it's Russia, Turkey, America, the Assad regime, and they're just ripping the blanket to pieces, pulling it in different directions. And the failure of countries around the region and around the world has been unique to each country. So I've already discussed how Britain and America just didn't do enough. War fatigue, not enough in it for them. Is this our problem? Shouldn't we get other people to fund this? How are we going to deal with this? And it was just constant questions of how, instead of what should we be doing, and action. Turkey reacted quite quickly. But it reacted in a way for its own, in many ways for its own benefit. It always despised the Assad regime and did all it could in the early years to fund the opposition to Assad, sending weapons and both military and non-military aid to the to groups which would eventually become jihadi groups in Syria against Assad. So they fueled them. And they cracked down on the Kurds being in the east of the country who were fighting back against ISIS. Although what Turkey saw as essentially was a Kurdish group that was rising in that part of the world, which in the early days, a lot of PKK fighters were rushing to defend these Kurds as well, PKK being a terrorist group in Turkey and being a separatist group, wanting to have more rights for Kurds in Turkey. And they were joining this group, although they weren't changing the dynamics of the group. The group was still Kurdish Syrian. It was still a Syrian Kurdish-led organization. The Turks saw this group as a huge threat because they were fighting for their liberty. They were talking about democracy and equality. They were openly speaking Kurdish. Well, Kurdish as a language was banned in Turkey until relatively recently. Turkey has long persecuted its Kurdish minority. It's an intensely nationalist state, which traditionally nationalist, but is becoming more Islamist as time goes on. The current president, Erdogan, is a Islamist supported, almost becoming a dictator, authoritarian, and he's got a lot of support from the Muslim Brotherhood. And he sees Syria, he sees the future of Turkey, I should say, as the recreation of the Ottoman Empire. He's very much Turkey's version of Putin. In fact, he's sort of the a child of both Putin and Trump, because just like Trump, he gets a lot of support from conservative Muslims all across Turkey. He sort of riles them up with inflammatory statements. But he has the buffoonery of Trump, but he has the sinister sort of authoritarianism of Putin, and that makes him a very dangerous man. And he's played the camp for a number of years. He's got a foot in both NATO and in the East. Turkey's the only country in NATO that does deals with both, does military operations with both NATO and with Russia. Turkey's the only NATO member that buys weapons from both the Americans and the Russians. So they've always had foot in both camps. And I think their persecution of the Kurds, their attack on the Kurds, and their funding of jihadist groups in Syria has just been a very clear example of one of the countries around Syria ripping the country apart, kicking over the apple baskets, and doing as much as they can to cause violence for their own political interests. And so a picture is emerging in Syria of countries either neglecting the country or actively destroying the country. And there are very few people who genuinely want just to bring peace, who just want to get rid of ISIS and restore order to Syria for the preservation of their culture and their nation, and also for their for future peace and everything else. So yeah, we've got a long way to go until nations around Syria do their part to help as well. Well, so the FSA, what happened with the opposition in Syria was a tragedy, as far as I'm concerned. In those early days, you saw a burst of human energy when it came to the Arab Spring. You saw communities across the Middle East saying, no more dictatorship. Gaddafi, the archetypal, sort of typical dictator of the past, who's ripped our country apart and raped and murdered for his own benefit. We want to get rid of him. Mubarak in Egypt, the fall of the government in Tunisia, the rise of protests in Syria, were just a way for people to say, look, we want change. The trouble is, from the get-go, this genuine sort of revolution, this genuine explosion of human energy was corrupted. And the FSA was never, the Free Syrian Army, was never a unified force. In the early days, it was full of young Democrats, young people who said, we want a Syria for all Syrians, where we're fighting the Assad regime that persecutes just about everybody. And that the Alawites population of Syria, which is the ethnic group in which the Assad gets its most support, and which Assad is himself, they make up only 10% of Syria. How is it right that that this community and this dictatorship governs the vast majority of the economy, dominates politics, dominates most sectors of life, yet the vast Arab majority and other minorities like the Christians and the Kurds receive nothing? Like, how is that right? So these are quite legitimate expressions, quite legitimate reasons to protest and to rise up and to try and drive for change in your own country. But the moment we started to fund these groups, and different countries began to get different influences over different groups in Syria, which helped to fracture the opposition even more. And the groups that were the most violent were the ones that actually were the most successful in gaining support and in growing and seizing territory. And the groups that were the most violent were the jihadists. So what you swiftly found was, as millions of people were pouring out of Syria and flooding into Europe and draining the country of its educated classes and of normal people, very swiftly the educated people who had joined the revolution in Syria joined them. They fought for a year or two against Assad, swiftly found out that al-Nusra, which is al-Qaeda in Syria, and ISIS and other terrorist groups were seizing territory and gaining ground and executing people who disagreed with them. They decided to leave. And then with growing anger and frustration, Britain and America, which was initially funding these groups and supporting these groups as well, starting to realize what they had birthed and what was being created in Syria, pulled off their support, wiped their hands of them, and directed all their funding towards the Kurds and helping the Kurds defeat ISIS. But then, obviously, the only groups left to support these fanatics, these jihadists, was countries like Turkey and other parts of the country, Saudi Arabia. But it was just a constant infight between groups. And now the countries have been pushed out. Jihadist groups have risen and fallen. Some have rebranded, and the picture that's emerged in eastern Syria now is actually a Turkish-backed FSA, which is largely Islamist, largely fanatical, and you've got the Russian-backed Assadist government, very successful. They retook Aleppo, and they have really started to push back against the rebels in that part of the country, and it leaves Democrats like myself now with just a tinge of sadness and just the afterglow of the shame that was the genuine FSA revolution. As far as I'm concerned, that's dead and gone. Like there's nothing good amongst the FSA in the east of the country. They're all fanatics. The incidences of mass rape, the random executions and murders of people in rebel occupied Idlib is just enormous. And it's just unsurprising that the fanatical leader, al-Baghdadi of the Islamic State, he wasn't captured in ISIS. He wasn't captured and killed. Sorry, he wasn't killed in ISIS territory. He was killed in Idlib. He was killed 30 miles from the Turkish border. There's a reason for that. It's because that's where he found sanctuary. That was the very place the Kurds couldn't get him. That's where the Kurds and the Americans and the Brits couldn't get him. Well, he thought they couldn't get him. Eventually, the Americans, with intelligence got by the Kurds, incidentally. The Kurds managed to capture people in ISIS territory that knew where this guy was. They had an informer on the inside as well, motivated by the money and by his hatred of ISIS. And the Kurds supplied the Americans with the intelligence. The Americans didn't even tell the Turks until a few hours before the operation started what they were going to do. And it shows you who the US military, the people on the ground, forget the politics for a second, who the US military trusts in Syria and who they don't. So, yeah, the picture in Syria is highly complicated. It's intensely frustrating for those that are genuinely motivated by peace and want to see order restored to Syria. I just fear that unless reality is brought home to people in the West, how can we ever have peace? How could it ever go back to normal? So we've got this war will continue for many years to come.
Unoptimistic note. Thank you very much for your time. I know it's been really fascinating, really interesting. I hope your book. Was it launched in May or something? It's been out for a while.
Yeah, end of May, right at the end of May. So it's been out for about a month now. So it's
doing well. I'll obviously put a link to where you can buy it in the description of the channel. But yeah, no. So thanks a lot.